This is the second topic of our introductory unit on cell structure. We spoke a little bit about cells in the previous topic when we were discussing the organization of the human body. And we talked about the cell theory, about how cells were central. But we also looked at many other levels of organization, like you see here. The key thing about cells is that they are alive. The other levels below that are not. These are the living units of all living things. All living things are cellular. So cells are the living foundation of the body. The other organizational levels below the cell, organelles, molecules, atoms, are not. So cells are the point at which we see life. And when you explain or when you state the cell theory, this is the kind of thing that you're addressing, that all living things are composed of cells. All living things are either a single cell or composed of many, many cells. That the cell is the structural and organizational unit of all living things. And if it's the structural unit of all living things, then it's also the functional unit, because we know that structure determines function. The third statement in the cell theory says that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So let's get a better understanding of what a cell is. In most textbooks, there's a picture, something like this, that shows what is purported to be a cell. Well, this is not any cell that you and I or anyone has ever seen. This is an artist's drawing to try to represent the parts of all cells. No cell in existence looks like this. It's a little bit like trying to say, okay, what does the general or typical human being look like? Well, you'd have to just draw a very, very simple picture without any details. And that's what we see here in this cell picture. Cells are very, very different from one another. One of the ways to illustrate that in our class is to look at 8 different cells and begin to get a bit of how they are all different and how they're all alike. Let's look at the 8 handouts that I provide in this class. So here is a cell that produces hormones. Here is a muscle cell. Well, the muscle cell doesn't look anything like the cell that produces hormones. Here's a white blood cell that fights infection in your body. It doesn't look like the others. The distal tubule cell that you see here is a cell in one of the tubes in the kidneys that helps move water from the urine back into the human body. And here's a neuron, a cell that makes decisions and transfers bits of information from one location in the human body to another. An adipose cell or fat cell doesn't look like any of the others here. Here's a bone cell. All the blackness around it is the hard bone material that this cell has produced. And here's a skin cell. What you want to take from this is that there is no one average cell. So the other thing that you can take from this is to ask yourself, why are they all so different? And of course, that leads us right back to one of the first statements in our class. Structure determines function, doesn't it? Each of these cells has developed a different structure because it has a different task or different job to do. So these cells have each a unique role to play. And we need to see the human body in its cellular totality as a community or a society. There are a couple of hundred different cell types. This is just 8 of those. But all of these hundreds of different kinds of cells work cooperatively together. We often say in this class, and I will say it again and again, I'm alive because my cells are alive. Everything I do is a cellular process. I am a community of cells. And these cells are then the structural units of life. These cells are alive. And when we talk about that, we're relating ourselves back to our last chapter or the previous topic that said there are certain activities of cells, and those activities like metabolism and reproduction and responsiveness and growth and development are all in the cell itself. The cell itself does these things. And so we can look at cells as really having 2 roles to play. They have a role to play for themselves. They have to develop and sustain their own life processes in order to do anything else. But they also contribute to the whole organism. Each cell provides a job, a task that benefits all cells, the entire human body. So when you think about that contribution, it's useful if we think of that contribution that the cell makes to the entire human body as either a service task or a production task. In other words, some cells produce a structure in themselves that serves the activities of the human body. Like this muscle cell builds a structure within itself that then allows it to contract and provide muscular movements for the human body. The white blood cell builds within itself the capacity to engulf and to destroy microorganisms. The tubule cell builds within itself the structure to pull water out of a kidney tubule. The neurons build within themselves a structure that allows them to make decisions and communicate those decisions along or across long distances in the human body. And the adipose cell provides a task of storing and saving fat molecules in the human body and releasing those at the right time. These are all cells that have built a structure within themselves that allows them to provide a service for the human body. Likewise, there are other cells that produce raw materials for the human body, like this bone cell. It is a living cell, but its task is not to contract or to fight infection. Its task is to produce bone material that accumulates and forms the structure and the hardness of bones. This hormonal cell produces a chemical message that has triggering effects in other cells in the human body that tells them to do a certain task at a certain time to help coordinate various activities in the human body. And this skin cell is one of those special skin cells that produces a protein called melanin, which is the color, the basic coloration of our skin. Melanin is a natural sunscreen. So many cells build an internal structure so that they can perform a task for the human body, and many other cells are involved in producing materials and substances that become a part of our human body. Now, we are going to be studying these images quite a bit. As we do, there are some things to think about as we look at these images. These images, these 8 images that I'm giving you, are actual images of real cells that existed in history. These are not artistic drawings. These were imaged through an electron microscope from some person's real tissue. Imagine that they took these tissues, most likely from a person who had passed away, and they took some fresh tissues from that human body. They froze them, they sliced them very thin, and then photographed those, not with light, but with electrons. And this was the image that was produced. Every part of this cell was exactly in that place when it was frozen in time. So these pictures are very, very, very valuable. And especially as these pictures were first made, they became the foundation for so much functional knowledge. These showed us organelles and structure inside the cell that had never been seen before. Where there's a drawback here is perhaps that these cells are simply two-dimensional. These are not a complete picture of the cell. When the slice passes through it, all these structures are cut, and so we just get a two-dimensional outline of all the organelles and structures here. So we can't think that we're looking at the entire cell or that we're seeing all of the cell when we look at one of these pictures. There may be certain organelles that do not show in some of these pictures that were actually existing in the cell, but were not in the place where the slice went through the cell. What is helpful with these, though, is if you get enough of these slices together, you can actually put together a three-dimensional image. And that's what, of course, the artist used in that general cell picture. The one real benefit of that cell picture is that you do get to see sort of a three-dimensional picture of the cell, which of course was developed mentally by looking at many, many images and beginning to get that three-dimensional sense of what these cells are. So we're going to use these pictures quite a bit, but it's helpful if you know the benefits and the limitations of each of these pictures. So let's sort of summarize this again. Remember this cell theory. Cells are the foundation for all living things. All living things are composed of cells. That the cell is the living unit of all living things. Life occurs in its cells. I am alive because my cells are alive. Everything I do is a cellular process. And then thirdly, and this is a statement that we want to explore a little bit in the next lecture, is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. There is no cell apart from a cell that came before. No one knows where the first cell came from. But today, in this life that we live, every cell comes from a pre-existing cell. It's probably pretty incredible to think that at one point in your life, all there was of you was a single cell. And that single cell was the union of a cell in your mother's body and a cell in your father's body. Those two cells united to make a brand new cell. That cell is multiplied and grown into the person that you are today physically. So let's explore that thought in our next unit.